over recent opinions coming from the West Virginia Supreme Court and how some of those opinions are impacting decision-making in the courtroom. So could you give us some highlights and tell us what's happening in Charleston?
And I even went through the recent opinions, even as recently as last night, just to kind of update myself and see if I was correct in what I was saying. And just remind everybody, you can go on West Virginia Supreme Court and look up their opinions anytime. And they categorize the JA cases as a JUV for juvenile cases, and pretty much tell they're your cases because they are in re, ET, JKM. The one that we're all talking about recently is JP, because that one stood for the principle of grandparent preference, which is a statutory preference that has always existed on the books. It's nothing new. So it's not really a new opinion, but the Supreme Court, when they rendered that opinion, in that case, they cautioned the court because the circuit court had denied grandparent placement, placed with foster parents who had custody for in excess of the 15 out of 22 months. I don't know how many months the child was with the foster home.
Judge, I'm going to ask you
Sure.
to kind of speak up. I'm getting some signals from our massive audience here.
The point is that the court had ruled against the grandparents, ruled in favor of the foster parents who the child had been with, under the principle of best interest of the child. And statutory or case law, even though we've always had a statutory preference for grandparents, the courts seem to have also always emphasized, but nothing trumps best interest of the child. And yet in this in re JP case, the court seemed to suggest that because there was a delay by DHHR in getting the grandparents' home study done, that we should not count that time against the grandparents. And so just the amount of time that the child was with foster parents versus that grandparent preference, without something more, just looking at time, they ruled that we should be placing the child with the grandparents. So it's left us all scratching our heads and saying, but what about the best interest of the child? And has that changed or hasn't it changed? And the way opinions come down is it's kind of a gradual thing. If you read the dissenting opinion, Justice Hutchinson, a former circuit court judge, really emphasized the need for best interest of the child. So over time, we're going to see through the developing case law, through the appeals, how the Supreme Court guides us in that. But right now, you're going to hear a lot of arguments about placement with the grandparents as far as being the statutory preference. That being said, look at the recent legislative changes that have been made. And even in there, and one of the things that CASA does in some cases for us is it helps us find kinship placements. At least we hope you guys are looking for that for us, because
we want to do more of that.
DHHR is tasked with I think they're supposed to file a list of all of the kinships that they are contacting and considering at the start of a case when they have placed in foster care over family. And oftentimes that's difficult. And if there's this tracking of kinship early on in a case, then later in a case where we've had a placement disruption, maybe we can go back to that list to tap on family members to see if their circumstances have changed, and if maybe now they are willing to take this child, that we're still looking for a family, because while we thought we had found the perfect family, and unfortunately even in cases where children have been adopted, we're still seeing placement disruptions because of so much traumatic injury that has occurred to the child, that the child is just struggling in their new adoptive home.
Right. This is probably less of a judicial question for follow-up, but when these opinions are released, if that's the right verb, do resources and support mechanisms follow? So if there's a grandparent preference, do we, you know, kind of assess what resources would go with that grandparent?
Well, I don't know about that, but I'll throw out there, I think throughout the state recently, we've got the grandparents family, Melody, help me.
Family first?
No? It's healthy grandfamilies. Thank you. I knew somebody in this room would know what I was talking about. I know, and I remember what I'm told enough to go, there's something out there for that. And I look around the room to see who's going to chime in. So the Healthy Grandfamilies program, I know in Morgan County, it's running out of starting points. I believe I've heard Berkeley County has one.
Children's Home.
Yeah.
Children's Home Society is running it.
The Berkeley.
So I know I used it for a family that couldn't utilize Pride, and we were looking into whether or not that Healthy Grandfamilies program might be able to better serve the needs of these grandparents who were going to be adopting their grandchildren.
Right, because I just know that's always the struggle.
It is. Second, third generations trying to raise children. I remember years ago it was a great-grandfather, and they were farmers, and they thought this internet stuff was just crazy. How dare this stuff, they introduced it to their home, they had it for less than 24 hours before they got rid of it. But yet they were raising these children, middle schoolers, and this is their life, right? These phones, the internet. We can't isolate these kids and tell them it doesn't exist because their future is there. So it was quite a struggle talking to this great-grandfather about why he needed to keep an open mind to these things called the internet.
Yeah, that's tough. I have to say, this is a very serious subject, but part of living on the farm is you get random animals coming through the door. It was a dog, but it could be a goat anytime, so bear with us. The subject is indeed serious, but yeah, so that was terrific. One other thing we talked about, and I was just fascinated by kind of what you're seeing and what we're all experiencing, and I love kind of putting the pieces together on this, is, you know, what we're seeing in the courtroom as a result of what's happening with COVID. Kind of what you're seeing today, and what do you imagine seeing as the months roll on?
You know, at the beginning, I thought, Lordy, this is just going to be an excuse for people that are failing. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but honestly, I don't believe that the case that I think COVID is being used a lot less than I thought it would be. I think we have all come together. I think some people have actually found it easier to obtain services due to COVID because of the internet. People have been able to tap into Zoom, and we've taken out the drive times and the whole driving and transportation issue that we see in all of our cases. And simply by getting these folks a cell phone, they're able to participate in some of these services. Even the Community Alternatives to Violence, I think, we're doing things remotely, which, you know, when you listen to these people's excuses for why they weren't able to go to those classes and attend those things, it was transportation, it was timing, and suddenly you put it and make it available right here on their phone. Hopefully they're learning just as much. That test is one we don't know the answer to, but at least attendance-wise, there's no excuse for not being able to do it.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And what about case numbers and severity and...
Well, again, I think at the beginning we were really concerned because we know that the number of referrals that were coming into the central database for DHHR was down. They just weren't getting the numbers. And the thought was, are we going to see just a lack of reporting, even though we know that people are struggling out there with the lack of resources and the stress that goes with that, and therefore the fall back on drug abuse, fall back on domestic violence, whatever the case may be. That being said, our numbers are actually up. They're a lot higher than they were last year. I forgot to check Berkeley County's numbers, but I don't think Berkeley County's numbers ever go down.
153.
But I know both Morgan and Jefferson have as many cases filed already this year as they had filed last year.
We have a question for Judge McLaughlin. With COVID, listing schools becomes problematic. Do you have any thoughts? Question from Debra Kennemily.
Do you want to maybe repeat the question?
Yeah, I don't, with listing schools, I'm not
You mean
sure.
visiting?
Visiting schools, must be.
Perhaps visiting.
Yeah, because the schools aren't letting us in is the concern, if I recall what I'm hearing correctly. And there's pluses and minuses to that. We go to the schools because it's easy and convenient for us to find the kids there. Some kids don't like to be visited at school. The older they get, the more embarrassed they get about it. So again, it's going to cause us to try to figure out alternatives.
I know I recently read one where the CASA volunteer had reached out to the teacher, and I think it was last year's teacher, because we're still early on in this. And I think those are people that DHHR doesn't always talk to. Those are people that our GALs don't always have the time to talk to. And they are a great resource of information. And so the fact that that worker put that information in there, and it gave me insight into some of the issues related to that case, I won't say that I was surprised by it. I mean, everything that the teacher said fit into our concerns perfectly, but it also gave us an avenue of sharing that concern in a different way to the whole MDT so that it can be discussed in a different way. Right. And one of the things that I've always had concerns about, based on past experiences, is we send folks to go to a counselor. And what is the counselor being told when the person arrives? And when I was a prosecutor, I remember having somebody go see a counselor that had picked up DV charges, domestic violence charges. There was an abusive at-home situation, so this wasn't a JA case, but obviously it's a family situation. And they saw the counselor 3-4 times. The counselor said, "You don't need to be here. I don't know why they're making you come here. You're done." And my concern is what did the counselor know about why you were sent here? Well, the counselor didn't know anything. And he went in and basically said, "Got in an argument with my wife, never happened before, don't know why I'm here, spoke a couple times, case closed." Well, that wasn't really an accurate truth. It wasn't the first time the police were called. There was a history of domestic violence. And, if the counselor doesn't know the background, garbage in, garbage out. Right. So making sure that our service providers have access to the material, to our concerns, and honestly, when you pick up a case in the middle of it, whether you're a GAL, because an old GAL switches jobs and has to relinquish their duties, going back and reviewing court reports, CASA reports, is a great way to get up to speed on a case ever so quickly. So some of the things, though, beyond just maybe talking to a teacher or some of those outside resources that we miss, it's just, are there concerns that we're missing about these kids? Sometimes foster parents, grandparents, they'll tell you, well, they gave me these kids and they didn't tell me anything. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what I'm not supposed to do. And DHHR would say, well, we gave them the booklet, and they probably did give them the booklet. But grandparents are busy. They haven't read it. They laid it down. They don't even remember if they got it or not. And it's much easier if somebody gives them the top 10 or something about what's available to them. So having you folks come in and do a little bit of cleanup for everybody is a good thing. And relaying that information in your reports is also helpful. If there's a concern that the foster parents, grandparents, or even a child expresses to you, add that stuff in. You know what DHHR is going to do. DHHR is going to go through and they met all their 3 times a week drug screens. They're checking this box, checking that box. But if you look at it from your CASA standpoint, from your best interest of the child standpoint, these are the things that the family needs. Did you look at the shoes on the kid? Does he need a new pair of shoes? There was a voucher given to this kid 6 months ago, but this kid is 12 years old. He's growing meets and bounds, right? He went from a home where he was getting minimal food to getting a home where food is plentiful. And now all of a sudden his clothes don't fit. What are the needs that we're missing? So those are all very helpful things to put in that court report, because it's not just for the judge, it's for the MDT, it's for everybody. So it's making sure the voice of the child is heard. If we have time, I'll tell you one sad story. I was a GAL for a short period of time, just 6 months, and I had a kid ask me a question about, what was going on with the improvement period, what did that mean? He was probably 13, 14 years old, old enough to understand what was going on. He recognized that his parents had a drug problem. He recognized that we were trying to get him help, but he desperately wanted mom and dad to be successful. And when I said that the parents were going to have to get a job, that was very concerning to him. And he looked at me and he said, do you mean a real job? Or can he just go out and pick up odd jobs each day and do work? And I'm like, well, typically the court makes them get a real job. And he's like, well, my mom can do that, but my dad's not going to be able to do that. He never has. He won't be able to do that. And if you make him, I know he's just going to give up and he's going to fail. And I'm never going to get him back. And that kid was highly upset by that. Mm. And you know what? While we would like for everybody to get what we call a real job, we have to meet people where they're at. And sometimes we have to accept some of the other types of employment that we probably don't want to accept, but we have to. Working, no matter what, is better than not working, in whatever form it comes in. But just hearing the kid say that
and so protective
made me more aware of what concerns we might have in this case that we need to make sure that we address, that maybe dad wouldn't tell us. Because really, even if dad gets a job for 6 months, once we close our case, is he really going to keep that job? So is it that important or isn't it? We got to focus on what we need to focus on and fix what we can fix to get these families to be unified. Before we got that grandparent decision, I think the series of new decisions that were coming down on the issue throughout the state of the fact that we don't follow our statutory guidelines. And I know, I did it just the other day. I said, let's not take dad's admissions and we're going to continue this case from multiple different reasons. But we really have to watch those statutory guidelines and follow them. Mm-hmm. And when we don't follow them, we need to make sure that we articulate why they're not being followed.
And which statutory guideline are you speaking of?
Well, improvement periods are pre-adjudicatory improvement periods. Mm-hmm. You get 6 months to complete. We can extend them for 3 months if there's substantial compliance. So if there's not substantial compliance, how do I extend it as a judge? And I think there's a recent case that came down about maybe 2 years ago where the judge just kept giving extension upon extension upon extension, and then when he terminated, the Supreme Court said, but you made all these substantial compliance findings. How can you make these substantial compliance findings to grant extensions and then say that they never substantially complied?
Judge, because we had some sound issues earlier, would you mind repeating the decision regarding the grandparent?
That was in Ray JP. It just came down. So right now they're on the fall 2020. So it was in the spring 2020 opinions. I don't have a case site, but if you go on West Virginia Supreme Court's webpage and go look at the tab at the top, they didn't update the tab, so the tab still says fall or spring 2019. If you click on it, it'll take you to spring 2020, even though it says spring 2019. I don't think anybody's told the Supreme Court that yet. Because I'm like, what happened to the spring 2020 opinions? But I clicked on it and it immediately popped up. But it's in Ray JP, it is a case to be read, but it's not to be read by itself. When you read it all, find that dissenting opinion, and you also have to go out there and they cite a couple of cases within it, and there's still good case law out there that has not been overturned by that decision. That talks still about best interest of the child. So there's an Elizabeth F. case, I think is what it was, where they discussed grandparent preference. That was, I can't remember the year, several years ago, more than 2. And in that case, they talked about the fact that the grandparents still had drug addict mom and dad in and out of their house, that if their children all had problems in the legal system and those kids were in and out of the house, and because of that, the court did not feel that it was in the best interest of the children to go with the grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an example, and I don't think that case, and nor does the Supreme Court, because that Elizabeth F. case has not been reversed, there's no red flag on it. So there are still fact scenarios where that grandparent preference does not trump the best interest of the child.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where it's still unknown. We have this flag waving, don't forget grandparent preference, and we know if you're just looking at how long a child has been in foster care versus how long, versus them wanting to move the child to grandparent, that alone is not going to be the test. It's not just going to be looking at a clock and saying too much time has passed, even though we have that rule about 15 months out of the last 22, I think is what it is,
right.
that we don't move kids. That's not the guiding force. It's almost like the grandparent preference trumps that if we don't have something more for an analysis of best interest of the child.
This year we've launched Fostering Futures. So we have a whole specially trained group of volunteers who are just working with kids 13 plus. And we are looking for your guidance on, cases that you want to make sure, to be sure that we're paying attention to. Because that was actually the other thing we talked about at lunch is
I still have to get to that name.
how we prioritize cases and how we are responsive to our judges when they think that this case could really use a CASA. So.
Yeah. And I think having that avenue open, and I know I can just shoot out an email and say, we really need a worker on this case. And you guys have always been good at responding to that. Fact that we need workers on certain cases more than other cases.
Right.
And identifying that.
Awesome. Any other questions? And Julia, I'm assuming your timing.
Dell's got one.
What guidance can you offer us to help foster a more collaborative or less territorial MDT?
Thank you,
Well,
Del.
anybody that ever participated in an MDT where I was a prosecutor, actually, I kind of took the lead on those MDTs. 20 years of doing JA cases and watching workers come and go just caused me to do that. Depending on who your GAL is, depends on who takes control of meetings. Each meeting that you go to is going to be different, and so I don't think there's one answer that fits all. I think just being able to maybe ask the right questions, like I pointed out before, when are we going to get to reunification? Has anybody thought about this? Has has anybody looked into whether or not there are any family members? Has anybody looked into whether or not there's a psychological? If you guys really know your resources, I think that too could be a help to the MDTs, because I think that's one of the things that I learned is some of these newer workers, they live in Berkeley County, they come to Morgan County, and they don't know what resources Morgan County has. They've never heard of starting points before. Same in Jefferson County. Jefferson County, you get, again, your workers from Berkeley County, they don't know what community ministries is. They don't know what our day report center's doing in addition to their regular stuff. So the more your CASA members can stay informed of what's available within your own communities or within the community of the child that you're serving, I think you could help. Because these families need something. I remember one family needed a stove, or they had the stove, they just needed it connected. And in that case, it was the GAL that went to her church and got the church to get that done, to get that final touch done. But every case is going to need somebody that can do that. And so maybe it's your CASA volunteer that has their own church that they belong to, that they can utilize to tap into that. I think people have had cleanup cases, right, where you've had a dump in the backyard and needed to somehow or another just help these people get over that hurdle. And it's knowing what your community resources are, I think can sometimes be very helpful, because so often we hear it can't be done, we don't have anybody providing that service. And then we learn later that there is somebody, we just didn't know it. So if you folks even talk amongst yourselves about new resources that you've discovered to make sure each other, when you, I don't know if you've got a email chain or anything, you can blast out to each other and say, this was a great resource for this thing, heads up about it.
Yeah, our volunteers get together in a chat and chew once
There
a
you
month.
go.
Saturdays and Wednesdays.
I
that
encourage you to talk about your favorite resource that you learned about, because those are helpful.
That's good. Del, go ahead. Oh,
I wanted to circle. I just wanted to circle back a little bit to talking about youth, specifically teenagers. What's your position on their presence in the courtroom?
In JA cases?
Yes.
Can everyone hear the question, or do I need to repeat it?
I'll go ahead and repeat it. The question was, what is my opinion as far as a child's presence in the courtroom? You know, I think it's up to the GAL, and it's their call. I think that's the job of the GAL. If you know that a child wants to be present, then I think as a CASA volunteer, you should make sure that the GAL is aware of it, so that hopefully the GAL will then follow up with that child on that fact. Because if they wish to be there, they can. And I think for some kids, some cases, everything's a timing thing as to when it would be good and when it would be bad. And every kid is different. I've seen so many kids that don't have any closure to the case, and I think they hit certain ages where we might remove them from their family, but they know who their family is, and this is why at 16, 17, they're in my court as a JD, and one of the things their adoptive parents are struggling with is that they've reached out through social media and are back to talking with their family who is still using drugs and not a good influence, and it's creating a conflict within the homes. And that's where some of those behavioral struggles and the lack of acceptance within that family on behalf of the child is coming from. So we can't totally exclude them from our JA cases, because if they're not informed, they think that their parents were just done a disservice and we wrongfully took them away from their parents. And honestly, there's nothing we can tell those kids that's going to change their mind. But sometimes if they see it with their own eyes, what's happening, it might give them a better understanding. But that's really a call between the GAL and their client. And I don't think it's up to me to insert myself. I think we have, at times we brought up the fact, do you want to step out of the courtroom for this, if they are there? And they might say yes, and they might say no. And sometimes the kids want to talk to the judge, and the GALs have made that happen as well. I've had private conversations in the back because they wanted to express their feelings, and they need to feel that they are being heard. And so if they have that desire, let the GAL know. If you want to include that in your report, include it in the report that they expressed a desire to talk to the judge. They just want to be heard, like everybody.
Thank you for that guidance.
I'll just give a quick time check. It's 6:06. We don't have any questions from our viewers right now, so we can continue to take questions from the room.
Okay, great. So Del and
I did have one more. Sometimes as volunteer supervisors, we have to really encourage some of our advocates who may get wearied by the court process. Can you give some encouragement, perhaps to some advocates who may be watching? Can you give some encouragement to our CASAs who may have become wearied with the court system process?
Sure. So anybody that's done this work knows we have terrible cases and then we have wonderful cases. And I've seen some wonderful CASA volunteers quit after some terrible cases. And sometimes it's good to take some time off before it gets really bad, take a step back, take a break for 6 months, and then come back to it. Because we do have good stories. And when you're in your chew and chat, talk about the good stories. Because sometimes we get so caught up in the bad stories and we want to vent about the bad stories. We really need to talk about those good stories. And I'll tell you one, because it just happened recently, within the past 6 months. We had a mom walking into court and she was going to relinquish. There was no way she could do any of this. And she was ready to relinquish. Her attorney was ready to relinquish. And I looked at her, and after a conversation with her, and I'm like, what is it that you think you can't do? And now every time she comes to court, I remind her about that day in court because she's doing so wonderful. And I'm convinced it's going to be a success story. And you get one of those success stories, and that gets you through the bad ones. Because I've equally had, the bad ones too. The knockdown, drag out. One side thinks that this home is the best. The other side thinks that that home is the best. And how do you decide? And you really have to not make it personal. And I think that's the hard thing for a volunteer to do, is not make it personal. Because there's no way I could do this work for 20 years plus and make it personal. It would eat you up, and it would put me at a counselor's office every day. So I know that's a hard thing to do because you fall in love with these kids, but don't make it personal. Recognize that everybody has a role to play in that courtroom. And you watch attorneys do it all the time, and cops always say, I don't understand how you and this defense attorney can go at it in court and walk out the door and go have a drink together. And it's because we don't make it personal. It is our jobs. We do what we believe our job requires us to do. And if everybody does their job, the right outcome will prevail. And so you can't take it personal. You have to trust everybody to do their job. If they're not, you can call them out on them in your court reports. You don't have to do it at an MDT so that it does not become adversarial. Ask questions in a way that's respectful, but makes people think. But don't take it personally.
Judge McLaughlin, we have a question regarding if you feel or think that some important information is missing, would you feel comfortable asking a CASA to follow up, and what advice would you have for that follow-up?
So anybody that's been in my courtroom knows I don't ever hesitate to ask a question or make a suggestion. I'm very vocal from the bench. And I don't know that I would ever directly suggest CASA do it, although depending on what it is, if I thought it was right, I probably would. I can't think of a specific scenario, but yeah, I would say yes, I would. As far as follow-up, we always have to go through the channel. So our communication is through our court reports. And I trust, if I've suggested it from the bench, that it would be something that it would be discussed by the MDT. So, hey, the judge asked me to follow up on this. I did, and share it with the MDT. Don't make everybody wait for that court report. Make sure you let the prosecutor know ahead of time. Make sure you let that DHHR worker know ahead of time. It doesn't have to wait for that court report. I mean, obviously I want it in that court report. Sometimes I need that stuff to jog my memory. 3 months is a long time. I try to do them every 60 days, but even then, it's a long time with a lot of cases in between. And sometimes just reading a couple sentences of court report jogs my memory enough to go, oh yeah, that's right. So it's very helpful.
Hi, I'm Nikki. So
Hi, Nikki.
I'm fairly new at CASA.
Nikki's
So
very
I don't know how this whole thing works, but my question is, when you see a case, what makes you think like we need a CASA on this? Like, is it a certain time period? Is it the situation the child is in?
Yeah, it's, well, the answer is you know it when you know it.
I'm going to use that.
Yeah. It's where, I'll give you an example. Over here in Jefferson County, we use Vicki Wiltshire almost like a life coach, but I've had cases in Morgan County years ago where CASA was almost like the life coach for these people. There's a certain CASA volunteer here that has an expertise where it comes to drug treatment. And I had one parent that just wasn't moving. Didn't seem to get it. And I said, you've got a resource right back there. and I know the CASA volunteer helped her out because the next time she came to court, she was where she was supposed to be in the process. Different DHHR workers have a different opinion as to how much hand-holding they should do with the respondent parents. Some do more, some do less. There's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. So where I have a worker who's less hands-on, it's nice to have a CASA volunteer in those cases to offer a little more hands-on. Because if there's going to be reunification and that's in the best interest of the child, you're communicating and offering that hand to the parent is sometimes just as important as your hand to the child.
And I think we talked about too, this was actually one of the lunch questions, I think. But some cases are just so straightforward that
Right.
you know that there's going to be a few months and
Some parents hit the ground running.
yeah.
That first adjudication, they've already gotten into rehab, they've got their follow-up, they've gotten a new job, and you're like, where did that come from? Why do I want to volunteer on that one? That one's sailing. I mean, yes, as a CASA volunteer, you want that one because it's a success story, and we need that sometimes. But I hate to say it, but I want CASA on the hard cases. I want that extra set of eyes. What can we be doing that might get this parent to the point where they don't feel helpless and that they can see some light?
Great, thanks. Anybody else?
We have about 15 minutes left, so plenty of time for questions from the...
When I took CLE classes, we were always happy when they ended the session early.
Yeah, they're okay.
Well, there's more room for questions if there are any.
But if not, that's awesome, and we're happy to always forward you questions. I hope you don't mind. I can always, give you a quick email if there's something
Depends on the
burning.
question. I reserve the
Oh,
right
that's true.
to decline.
Not case related.
Not case-related.
I got the rundown today. Yes, Julia.
So we do have another question. What do you find most helpful getting from a CASA?
I have a question.
Your audience. All right, well, let's do that one. This one first. What do I find most helpful in my reports? Honestly, just when it tells me specifically what the concerns are, get to the point. Be succinct. Sometimes I have all the time in the world, but sometimes these reports are getting filed less than 24 hours before the hearing. And so I'm reading them real quick. So get to the point. If there is a concern, make sure it's highlighted as a concern. If somebody should be praised, take the moment to praise that person too, because praise is just as important. as the concerns. Letting a parent know that struggling, that they did something right, might just be, I had a defendant once write to me and just say I had said something to them that they felt caused them to, I think it was something about being that they themselves was worth the effort, was worth the chance at going through that rehab or whatnot. And they were successful. So being told that somebody is worthy of something, that praise is just very important. So realize it's not just the judge that's reading your court report. To me, I want to know if there's a concern, if somebody's missing something, if this child needs something, I want to know that. But I also want to know if somebody's not of concern and that I need to praise them for something. Tell me that. So I praise that person. Because having a judge say it to you, I know from drug court, means a lot. Caseworkers should be preparing their own report to the court. So that's why I think that's a good place to get started on a case, especially if the case is maybe 3 months in or something and you missed the beginning. I think they're a good resource to get started. But the idea of CASA is that CASA is going to be an independent investigator. And that we're not just going to believe the DHHR worker because they said so. That if they report something, then we're going to go behind them. And it's not that we don't believe them, but it's doing your own independent investigation. And I get what you're saying as far as what do we do when we can't go door to door to people? How do we get them to return our calls? But you will find school teachers are very willing to talk to you. The reason why our numbers are down in terms of reporting is because the schools weren't there, and that plethora of referrals that we get from schools was not happening. So those teachers, when they learn that you're on a case, that you have that court order that allows them to talk to you, and they're going to need to see that court order, they will not talk to you without it, they will share with you things about this kid that you only learn by talking to their teacher. So that's a good first place to start with. And I don't know if you have young age kids or high school aged kids. So if you can't talk to the child and you have a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, then you really need to reach out to those family members. Call up the parents and find out about who their family members are, and then follow up with those people as far as doing your own independent investigation. One of the things that I worry about is the fact, I have a recent case that happened where we had placed with a non-offending father, and the father died of a drug overdose. And that is just demoralizing, because nobody had brought it to our attention. And nobody had concerns about it. And we trust everybody to disclose, but they don't. And sometimes you're going to have to go to the aunt or the uncle to find out that somebody has it, because the mom's not going to tell you, or grandpa's not going to tell you, because it's a family secret. And so you might have to go to the school teacher to learn that non-offending mom had other issues when the child was with her, or dad, or whatnot. And so look outside the norm, look outside your MDT, and see if there's somebody that nobody's talking to. And that's who I would suggest you try to reach out to and talk to as a CASA volunteer. People who are the custodian of the children need to be present. What we're doing is in the best interest of the child. So knowing what these child's needs are, I always found it very helpful when I had the foster mom at my MDTs saying, first off, telling a parent your child learned to walk, or your child likes this food, or your child, let's just say the kid broke its arm on the playground. Here's how your child broke their arm on the playground. It's going to go a long way to this parent to actually have heard the story from the foster parent, and that's the only chance they ever get to talk to that foster parent is at that MDT. rather than just hearing it from the DHHR worker who reported it to them. They don't really know what happened. They're concerned, you know. So I would encourage those folks to be at the MDTs, whether it's by Zoom or in person, whatever we can do to make it more convenient for them to be there, because there are situations where they share some much needed information. The fact that when the child first came to them that they couldn't sleep at night, were bedwetting, whatever it might be, they have knowledge that needs to be shared with that MDT. In the courtroom, I don't always ask them for updates, although if I see them back there, I'll usually look at them and say, how are the kids doing? If for no other reason, then those parents need to hear it also, how their kids are doing. And so I think that's a great thing when they're able to come and share that with us.